Hello and welcome to the Record of Arms. I'm your host Mark 7, and as always I'm glad to have you here with me today for another discussion of military history. Today we're going to go back to a series we left off with a few weeks ago, and return to our examination of the wartime career of the American Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. When we last talked about the SBD, we examined the decisive role these bombers played in the pivotal Battle of Midway, fought in the Central Pacific in June 1942. In this clash of carrier fleets, Dauntless units, both Marines flying from shore bases and Navy carrier squadrons, inflicted a terrible defeat on the Imperial Japanese Navy, sending 4 of its largest carriers to the bottom as well as some lesser surface vessels. This would be bad enough, but most of the elite of our naval aviators, along with their almost irreplaceable experience gathered in the years of the China Wars and the offensives of the first months of the Japanese Blitzkrieg in the Pacific, perished in the infernos aboard the stricken ships or went to the bottom with them. Now we're going to look at the subsequent battles to the southwest, where the Japanese were still advancing among the islands to the north and northeast of Australia. It would be here that the Americans and their Australian allies would make their first effort to turn back the tide of Japanese aggression. My sources for this one will be Douglas SBD Dauntless by Peter C. Smith, and SBD Dauntless Units of World War II by Barrett Tillman. For details about the Japanese ships, I'll be using Jane's Fighting Ships of World War II. So with that out of the way, let's return to the warm, tropical waters of the Southwest Pacific, where Titanic showdown was destined to be fought out in the picturesque setting of clear, sparkling tropical waters, relentlessly lush and green islands. With the advantage of hindsight, it may be easy to see that the defeat at Midway had foreclosed the possibilities of Japanese expansion in the Pacific. But at the time this was not so apparent, and operations built up momentum of their own. As a result, successive shocks of the Coral Sea and Midway did not stop the forward advance of the Japanese push into the colonial domains of the Western Allies. This was taking place in the Southwest Pacific, in the island groups to the northeast of Australia as well as on New Guinea. The rebuff at the Coral Sea, despite what is usually claimed, did not halt the Japanese drive here. The heavy losses at Midway, though crippling in a wider strategic sense, made little immediate impact on the tactical or operational situation in this part of the Pacific. As a result, 6 more months of bloody fighting on land, at sea, and in the air would be required to finally bring this advance to a halt. These fiercely contested battles pitted the American airmen against crack Japanese Army and Navy flyers, many of whom were highly skilled veterans of the China Wars, just as deadly as the elite naval aviators lost at Midway. Likewise, their compatriots on land and sea were highly skilled and determined, far more battle experience and training than would be typical for Japanese fighting men later in the war, when the effects of Japan's limitations as an industrial and military power vis-a-vis the United States began to tell. As a result, the battles in the Solomons and the New Guinea campaigns were fought between forces that were comparatively evenly matched. This made their course much more unpredictable than would be the case in the later battles of the Pacific War, when American material and training superiority would virtually decide the issue at the outset. In these bitter, desperate, back-and-forth contests, the Dauntless dive bomber would play a critical part, as it had in almost every significant action in the Pacific War so far. The reigning prongs of the Japanese southward movement were 2 in number. One was moving through New Guinea and the surrounding small islands which formed the barrier to the north of Australia. This advance was contested by a combined American-Australian force. The U.S. Army forces deployed here included Army Air Corps squadrons flying the A-24 Banshee, the Army's adaptation of the Dauntless design. These aircraft had been present in the Southwest Pacific since the early part of the U.S. buildup of forces in Australia in the early months of the war, and they now continue to fly against Japanese Army units fighting against the Australians in the forests and mountains of New Guinea, and against the shipping in the surrounding waters that supported the offensive. This episode will not cover the operations of these Army dive bombers, the only specialized dive bombers that the Army Air Corps were ever to use. The next episode in this series will cover the desperate struggle of the Banshee squadrons against the Japanese offensive. The other arm of the Japanese advance reached to the east, through the Solomon Sea and into the islands of the Bismarck Archipelago. Here, the Japanese were occupying and fortifying the island, and had reached the southeast end of the island group. By May of 1942, had established themselves on the large island of Guadalcanal and smaller ones of Tulagi in Florida. A series of strikes by the Yorktown on the 4th had located and hit Japanese installations on Tulagi and on the much larger island of Guadalcanal. Though these resulted in the sinking of a pair of cargo vessels and a destroyer, they had done little to affect the progress of the Japanese buildup here. The most important item noted in the buildup was an airstrip recently observed to be under construction. This is being hacked out of the thick forest at a place called Lunga Point, near the center of the northern shore of Guadalcanal, one of the few pieces of flat land large enough to host one. Seaplane base was also being set up on Tulagi, which would be capable of hosting long-range flying boats, enabling these patrol bombers to cover virtually the entire Southwest Pacific theater. The completion and consolidation of these bases, if allowed to be carried through to completion, could allow the Japanese to use their air power to greatly constrict and complicate the traffic between the US and Australia, if not cut it off altogether. To eliminate these threats, the Americans put together a plan, known as Operation Watchtower, to take these two islands and the air bases before the Japanese could use them to effect. A large proportion of the American Pacific Fleet was assigned to cover these operations. 3 U.S. Navy carriers, under the command of Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, would be included in the naval forces assigned to guard the invasion convoy and to support the landings. Leading the force would be the tireless Enterprise, veteran of the Coral Sea and Midway battles, with 36 Dauntlesses included in her air group. She would be joined by the Saratoga, with 37 more, and the Wasp, which carried 30 more divided into 2 squadrons, VS-71 and VS-72. The landings themselves were carried out by the 1st Marine Division. These made the transit across the Pacific to the Solomons area in 15 attack transports escorted by a strong force of cruisers and destroyers, while the heavy units of the fleet provided more distant cover. First days of August, they approached their target, and on the 7th, the bloody battle for the Bismarck Archipelago began as Marines went ashore on Tulagi and Guadalcanal, as well as on the nearby island of Gavutu. The amphibious landings were supported by heavy naval gunfire and strikes on shore targets and beach defenses by the carrier planes, including the dive bomber squadrons. Direction of the dive bomber attacks was put in the hands of 2 officers. Commander Harold Felt, commander of the Saratoga's air group, was responsible for the operations against Guadalcanal. His counterpart in the Enterprise, Maxwell Leslie, performed the same function for the strikes against Tulagi. In the pre-dawn twilight, 15 of WASP's SBDs hit the seaplane base at Tulagi, along with 9 from Enterprise's VS-5. This latter unit, armed with 1,000-pound or 450-kilogram demolition bombs, struck the radio station in the flak positions on the island's southwestern coast. At 0700, a second strike, including 18 dive bombers from VB-6, arrived carrying more 1,000-pounders. These attacks were not unopposed. The fighters of the 3 carriers were able to immediately establish air superiority in the landing area, where the only Japanese fighter presence on hand to oppose them was a small force of float planes at the Tulagi base. More effective opposition came later in the day, when veteran fighter units began to appear over the invasion beaches along with twin-engine bombers from Rabaul and other bases. As was typical of Japanese operations in this early phase of the war, counterattacks came quickly, with the first waves heading out at midday on the 7th. The bombers were accompanied by strong fighter escorts flying the deadly, long-range Mitsubishi A6M0. In one of the first big air battles over the islands, a force of 17 Zeros from the Tainan wing clashed with 18 U.S. Navy Wildcat fighters and trounced them, shooting down 9 of the American fighters for the loss of just 2 of their own. An SBD from the Wasp was also downed in this combat. This dive bomber kill was the work of Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai, who was already credited with more than 50 Chinese, American, and Allied planes by this time. The Japanese ace shot down the SBD of Lieutenant Dudley Adams of Squadron VS-71, then came upon a formation of 8 more dive bombers circling Tulagi, looking for their target. He and his wingman, Petty Officer Second Class Enchi Kakamoto, swept down on the Americans and made repeated firing passes. On the last of these, the Zeros made hits on 2 of the dive bombers and saw one of them knocked out of his place in the formation. However, defensive fire from the Navy plane's rear gunners smashed into Sakai's cockpit, and he was hit by multiple .30 caliber machine gun rounds. Terribly wounded, he put his plane into a steep dive, descending rapidly from almost 8,000 feet or 2,440 meters, before leveling out just above sea level. Despite his wounds, Sakai managed to fly his riddled aircraft all the way back to Rabaul, a distance of more than 550 miles or 885 kilometers, what was truly one of the most remarkable feats of flying skill and sheer determination to survive to be found even in this savage conflict. The formation these 2 Japanese fighters attacked was Flight 319 from the Enterprise, commanded by Lieutenant Karl Hornberger, including 6 Dauntlesses of VB-6 and 2 from VS-5. 5 of the SBDs were reported damaged, though luckily for them this was not serious enough to disrupt their formation. No crewmen were hurt. One of the Japanese planes, Sakai's, was last observed to be diving into the sea after being hit in the cockpit, and was claimed shot down by the defensive fire of the Dauntless formation. The Japanese fighters themselves claimed to have shot 2 of the dive bombers down. However, in reality, no aircraft at all were lost in this skirmish, and the only major damage was to Sakai and his plane. The Dauntlesses of the carrier air group would continue to blast Japanese positions on the islands until the following night. These were flown throughout the daylight hours. The average plane and crew racked up 7 missions each in this initial 2-day period of the battle. Then, on the evening of the 8th, Fletcher made the controversial decision to withdraw his carriers to a point about 120 miles, 190 kilometers, to the northeast of the battle zone. This decision was taken in light of the known Japanese land-based air strength in the area, which presumably would be in the process of rapid reinforcement, and of the potential threat posed by the remaining Japanese carriers, whose whereabouts were unknown. Were a Midway-style disaster to befall the U.S. Navy while its air groups were preoccupied with support of the troops ashore, the Americans would be left all but powerless in the Pacific. The loss of even 2 of the carriers present would put them in an even worse position than the Japanese found themselves in after the June defeat. Not only would the success of Operation Watchtower become all but impossible, but the survival of the forces ashore and the service fleet in the area would be seriously jeopardized. However valid was the reasoning behind Fletcher's decision, the withdrawal of the carrier fleet left the Marines ashore without air cover. The half-finished Japanese airstrip near Lunga Point had been taken early on the fighting, but it was in no condition to receive or to operate aircraft. While heavy fighting against the Japanese troops on the island continued, work there was pushed ahead with maximum intensity to get the field into a fit state to host the air units the Americans would need to withstand the inevitable Japanese counterblow. This would not be achieved until the 19th, and not a day too soon, as already by that date Japanese troop convoys with strong naval support were moving in to contest the shaky American hold on the malarial, thickly forested and swampy islands that the Marines would soon come to know as the Green Hell. The initial success of the Marine landings against the comparatively weak Japanese garrison that was initially present on the island at the time of the invasion was just the opening engagement of a series of savage and bloody actions that would stretch over the next 6 months. These clashes on land and especially at sea would decide the fate of the opening phase of the Allied comeback in the Pacific. In these harrowing battles, in which the Japanese and American forces were more evenly balanced than at any other time in the war, the SBD would play a crucial role. On the next day, August 20th, first Dauntlesses arrived at the newly operational airstrip, now renamed Henderson Field in honor of the Marine pilot lost leading the first dive bomber strike against the Japanese fleet in the Battle of Midway. These aircraft were from Marine Air Group 23, consisting of 2 squadrons, VMSB 231 and VMSB 232, under the overall command of Major Richard Mangrum. First squadron to be sent to the field was 232, equipped with 12 SBD-3s. Mangrum had commanded this outfit throughout 1941. They had been at that time at Ewa Field in Hawaii, equipped with planes from the first batch of the SBD-1s, at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack. The squadron played little part in this action, as nearly all of its planes were wiped out on the ground during the opening raids. The Marines flew into Guadalcanal after taking off from the escort carrier USS Long Island. Along with the Wildcat fighters of Squadron VMF-223, they established themselves at the new airfield. Their counterparts in 231 remained at the advanced training base at Espiritu Santo, making ready to reinforce their comrades when their turn came. Ground personnel came by destroyer from Efate, but not the entire normal complement that would be found at a stateside base. Though the new base had a runway and bare facilities, it was very poorly equipped to support combat operations. There was a lack of manpower, poor food, and the stress of frequent bombardments and other instances of enemy fire, to say nothing of the hazards of the tropical climate and of endemic diseases, chiefly malaria, to which the Marines were exposed. Specialized equipment that would have facilitated the servicing of the aircraft was lacking. To cite one example, there were no hoists to lift the bombs, and the 500-pounders had to be manhandled to the aircraft and into position for mounting on the racks. Very taxing procedure, especially when it had to be repeated a dozen times or more to arm a wave of strike planes. Of course, this circumstance made the use of the larger 1,000-pound bombs very difficult and time-consuming. Also, fueling equipment was limited to hand-operated pumps, which wore out quickly with constant use in the humid atmosphere. Aviation gasoline would have to be pumped from heavy 55-gallon metal drums, which would also have to be manhandled into position. All this meant that turnaround time between missions was longer, and that flight crews of the planes would of necessity assist in the laborious and physically taxing process of refueling and rearming their plane. The strain on the few ground crew available was increased by the subsequent arrival of Navy planes on the field, which arrived without any support personnel or equipment of any kind, and so had to be serviced by the few men ashore as well. Lieutenant Commander Louis J. Kern, leading Navy Squadron VS-3, which arrived on the field on the 6th of September, describes the situation he found there, almost a month after the field had been taken from the Japanese. Quote, "We were faced with the problem of trying to find some place to stay and someone to feed us. CUB-1 had a detachment there which was supposed to have some aviation maintenance men. We found they were occupied with unloading ships most of the time, or carrying ammunition to the various dumps, but they did have some fueling details. The Marines weren't able to take care of our maintenance problems, or feed us, but they did supply us with a couple of tents and some cots. Some of us brought cots and mosquito netting up from Espiritu Santo in anticipation of the shortages at Guadalcanal. In addition, the aircraft themselves had not been adapted to use the tropical airstrip, with its rolled coral runway. They were still fitted with the solid rubber tires used aboard the ship, which tore huge ruts in the surface of the runway, necessitating repair after almost every sortie. Also, as these runways deteriorated, they produced large quantities of sharp-edged gravel, which was thrown in the air by the moving aircraft and tore up their undersides, particularly the trailing edge flaps of the dive bombers. This would have been solved or at least alleviated by the use of regular pneumatic tires of the type used by land-based planes, but none of the proper type were forthcoming. An expedient was the use of wooden tires, and this was experimented with by Southwest Pacific Command personnel at Noumea, but proved just as troublesome. In the end, the dive bombers were forced to fly not from the airstrip itself, but from a nearby meadow dubbed the cow pasture, leaving only the fighters to fly from the strip itself. Not long after their arrival, on the 24th, the Marines were joined by Navy planes which also flew from the field, including 11 Dauntlesses of Flight 300, drawn from the air group of the Enterprise and sent to the base after the carrier was damaged in the Eastern Solomons carrier battle. The American code name for Guadalcanal Island was Cactus, and thus the Navy and Marine aircraft flying from here became known as the Cactus Air Force. The SBDs of the Cactus Air Force now embarked on a period of intensive activity. In broad outline, dominance in the battle alternated between the Japanese and the Americans with darkness and daylight, with the Japanese Navy calling the shots in the dark and the American aircraft dominating the tactical situation in the daytime. Unlike during the landing operations, the SBDs were employed primarily against naval targets, either the ships of the frequent troop and supply convoys that the Japanese dispatched from the direction of Rabaul, or the survivors of the hard-fought night battles between the surface forces of the opposing fleets that daylight found still within striking range, which was about 200 miles or 320 kilometers from the island. This is not to say that they were not used in strikes on land targets, often on the defensive perimeter of the airfield itself, in support of their Marine comrades fighting on the ground. The fast pace of the operations and the repeated attacks from land, sea, and air that the personnel here endured imposed incredible hardships on the men. Nevertheless, they performed prodigies to keep their planes in flying shape, and at all points in the battle a force of Dauntlesses, however small or battered, stood ready to fly into harm's way. The tropical weather, with frequent downpours and massive thunderstorms in the afternoons and in the early evenings, compounded the maintenance difficulties, and sometimes posed hazards to flight operations. This hazard was not minor either. As Major Mangrum himself says, quote, "Only once during our stay we had to abort a mission due to a severe line squall which prevented us from getting to the north. I lost 2 planes, however, and their crews to the weather. They tried to barge through a buildup and apparently it had a hard core." The Marines of 232 Squadron soon established standing 2-plane patrols up the length of the Solomons chains at dawn and dusk, and this basic reconnaissance was supplemented by the efforts of the so-called Coast Watchers. These were Allied civilians, usually plantation owners, missionaries, or other pre-war residents of the islands, who remained behind after the Japanese occupation and reported on their movements by sea with clandestine radio sets. The information provided by these men proved invaluable in directing air attacks on the numerous troop convoys and bombardment squadrons Japanese would sail down the so-called slot, which is the relatively straight channel between the Solomon Islands along the route from Rabaul to Guadalcanal. Over this stretch of warm water and thickly forested islands, the SBDs would fly many missions against enemy shipping of all kinds, anti-submarine patrols, as well as attacks in support of land forces on Guadalcanal and nearby islands. To give an idea of the kind of job the Dauntlesses were doing in these difficult circumstances, we can take a look at the logbook of Mangrum's flight officer, Captain Bruce Purser. Between August 20th and September 17th, this man flew 28 missions, including 10 strike missions, 8 overwater searches looking for shipping, 7 reconnaissance sorties in support of the ground forces, and 3 anti-submarine patrols. The danger posed by Japanese night action was illustrated in the fighting that was occasioned by the passage of one of these Japanese convoys, bearing 1,500 men, that was sent down the slot to reinforce their embattled forces on the islands. At 02:23 hours on the 25th, an American flying boat spotted these ships. As per normal Japanese practice, the plan for Operation Ka, as the reinforcement operation was called, included diversionary attacks by separate forces detailed off from the main squadron. One of these was a force of 4 destroyers sent to carry out a night bombardment of the field. These hit the field, then sped away to join the troop convoy and its escorting force, which was made up of the light cruiser Jinsu and 3 destroyers under the command of Rear Admiral Tanaka. The Marines and the Navy pilots of the newly arrived Flight 300 did not take the bombardment line down. 2 missions were flown against the bombarding ships in the pre-dawn darkness. At 02:30, a pair of SBDs went after them, but were unable to do any damage, while another element of 3 that took off at 0400 had worse luck, likewise scoring no hits but also losing one of their number, which became lost and was forced to ditch in the sea off the shore of Malita Island after exhausting its fuel. The 3rd strike arrived over the troopship convoy and its escort, now joined by the bombardment force, at 0740. This one, consisting of 5 Marine SBDs, was more successful. The Japanese aboard the ships mistook the American dive bombers for friendly planes and held their fire until the Americans actually began their attack. As a result, The Americans were able to begin their dives and go after their targets practically unopposed. The lead plane was flown by the air group commander, Major Mangrum. He dove steeply onto one of the Japanese warships, but his release gear failed and he was unable to drop his bomb. The next 3 planes down scored close near misses on the Japanese vessels and observed their bombs to explode hard alongside their targets. The last SBD, flown by Lieutenant Larry Baldinis, who had been one of the 2 pilots to try and hit the destroyers in the O-230 sortie, was more fortunate. He scored a direct hit on Tanaka's flagship Jinsu. His bomb exploded on the light cruiser's deck between its forward turrets, destroying its radio room and starting a large fire. The ship was saved by a speedy decision to flood her magazines, but she was out of the fight and was sent back to the fleet base at Truk under escort. Tanaka transferred his flag to one of the destroyers. Not long afterwards, an anticlimactic epilogue of this marine strike occurred, when the unfortunate Mangrum, no doubt exasperated by his bomb release failure, returned in its SBD, the release gear of which had been corrected, and made a solo dive on a troop ship, which he missed. He described his experience thus, quote, "The SBD bomb release was mechanical. Yank a lever connected by a wire to the release. Maybe I simply didn't yank hard enough. I simply don't know why the bomb hung up, as it used to happen occasionally. At any rate, it released all right when I went back with it. Despite his lack of success, his decision going back into harm's way alone to deliver his attack was deemed sufficiently valorous that the Major was recommended to receive a Congressional Medal of Honor for his effort. Release gear failures of this kind were a frustrating feature of early Dauntless operation, which was corrected later by the addition of an electrical release system to replace the mechanical system. After the Marines were through, 3 Navy SBDs appeared to make their attacks on the convoy. These set off at 08:07 hours and were led by Lieutenant Turner Caldwell. 2 of the attacks were unsuccessful. However, Ensign Christian Fink pushed his dive home successfully and scored a devastating hit on the transport Kinru Maru, which was set on fire and abandoned. A last attack by 9 dive bombers set out up the slot to hit them again in the afternoon, but were unable to locate them. Instead, the SBD stumbled on a lone Japanese destroyer about 150 miles or 240 kilometers to the northwest of Guadalcanal, and they attacked her, claiming 3 near misses and heavy damage to the ship, which was however not confirmed by post-war analysis of Japanese records. Opposition to the SBD missions on the part of the Japanese fighter force was surprisingly slight, and the SBDs usually flew their sorties without fighter escort. Major Mangrum describes the situation this way, quote, "The essential task of our fighters was to protect the beachhead against air attack, and they were superb at this job. They were not available to provide cover for the SBDs. Conversely, the primary task of the Japanese fighters was to protect their bombers, and Guadalcanal was at about their maximum radius of action. Thus, they had no time to go after us, and we could usually keep out of their way, or seek some friendly clouds if some stray hostiles showed up." Another notable action against Japanese shipping took place 3 days later, on the 28th. 4 Japanese destroyers, carrying about 400 Japanese soldiers taken on in the Shortland Islands, were on their way to rendezvous with another group of 4 destroyers, which were also loaded with troops, coming from Borneo. Before the rendezvous could be accomplished, however, the destroyers were found. They were spotted by a scouting pair of SBDs at 1700 hours at a position 125 miles, or about 200 kilometers, to the northwest of Guadalcanal. The scouts radioed in their reports, and after shadowing the enemy for some time, the pair made attack dives to deliver their own bombs. However, these attacks were ineffective. A force consisting of 11 SBDs took off from Henderson to deal with the destroyer transports. They came from both the Navy and the Marines. 5 Navy planes found one of the 4 ship groups as the sun was setting, at about 1830 hours. The enemy was proceeding away from the island, having reversed course in the late afternoon. This was a common tactic of the Japanese ships. Once darkness had fallen and the risk of air observation was lessened, the destroyers would turn and run in at full speed, unload their troops, and run out again in hopes of being out of striking range before dawn. The tactic did not work this time, however, and the Navy pilots, and the Marines that arrived just afterwards, had light enough to carry out a coordinated attack. They would approach from 2 quarters, the Navy planes from the east, and the Marines coming in from the southwest. Japanese anti-aircraft fire brought down one of the Marine planes on the way in, but the others pressed their attacks down to 2,000 feet or about 600 meters. The SBDs decimated this destroyer group. Ensign Harold Buell scored a direct hit on the Asagiri, which set off her magazines and blew her to smithereens, along with 61 of her crew. Another Navy pilot, Ensign Christian Fink, followed up his earlier success by putting a 1,000-pounder into the Shirakumo that disabled her engines. One of the Marines hit the Yugiri on the funnel and started a fire that forced her to turn back. The Amagiri, the last ship in this section, was slightly damaged by a near miss. The disabled Shirakumo and the Yugiri were first to turn back, the former under tow. Though only one of the destroyers was actually destroyed in this attack, the dive bomber strike was effective in preventing the landing of the reinforcement mission. The troops embarked aboard 3 out of 4 of these ships never made it to the islands as a result of this devastating strike by the dive bombers. The other 4 ships, however, were not attacked, and met up with another destroyer transport squadron in the area and put their men ashore at Cape Taivu. Though these small groups of light ships may seem like paltry targets for a weapon meant to put down capital ships and fleet carriers, these destroyer transports were absolutely vital to the Japanese effort in the Solomons. The Japanese kept their efforts supplied and reinforced by numerous stealthy landings of small batches of men and supplies and night runs by small craft. These became known as the Tokyo Express. Any student of the Solomons campaign will be familiar with stories of the night landing of troops from destroyers, submarines, minesweepers, and other light ships, as well as by barges and rafts, and of supplies being dropped over the side of vessels and sealed oil drums to float ashore. This approach was typical of Japanese operational thinking, in that it relied less on logistical planning and material strength, but on intangible warrior qualities such as determination, courage, and daring. This kind of mindset is pervasive enough throughout the record of Japanese operations in the Pacific War, with other manifestations including the more famous Banzai Charge and the Kamikaze attack. This approach represents an attempt to compensate material and numerical inferiority with the increased determination, courage, and discipline of the individual combatant. The resort to naval expedients of this kind to supply their forces in the Solomons was chiefly the result of the American air threat from Henderson, embodied more than anything else by the danger posed by the SBDs. During the battles for this island, which lasted from the August landing until the first part of February 1943, 5 Marine dive bomber squadrons as well as 4 from the Navy would operate from Henderson. Without the threat of attack from the air posed by these strike planes, Japanese ships could have remained in the surrounding waters throughout the day, and large-scale landings with heavy warships in support could have been undertaken. As it was, these operations had to be limited almost exclusively to the hours of darkness. So before we continue with the story of the Cactus Air Force, let's take a look at their principal opponents at sea, warships that the Japanese used to support the reinforcement operations in the island group. These consisted primarily of light cruisers and destroyers, so we'll select representatives of each type to examine in a little bit of detail. I'll start with the light cruisers. I'm going to select the light cruiser Jinsu, typical interwar Japanese design for this class of warship. It's part of the 3-ship Sendai class, and is named after a Japanese river. The Sendai class was a revision of the Nagara class, and was more or less identical in most respects, though a refinement of the power plant and hull gave her a better speed, capable in good conditions of 35 knots or 65 kph. Like most ships of her type, the 5,200-ton Jinsu was lightly armored, with protection limited to a 2.4-inch or 6-centimeter belt and a 1.2-inch or 3-centimeter deck. Her speed and agility were intended to be her main protection. She was built in the Kawasaki shipyards at Kobe. Construction commenced in August of 1922, and she was completed almost exactly 3 years later, the end of July 1925. Her main gun armament consisted of 7 5.5-inch or 14-centimeter 50 caliber Type 3 guns, a type that was widespread in Japanese service and often formed as secondary batteries of battleships, as well as being widely used on land and coast defense batteries. This main battery was supplemented by 2 8-centimeter or 3-inch 40 caliber Type 3 dual-purpose guns, which were her only anti-aircraft weapons. This was her gun layout as it was when she was completed. By the time of the Solomons campaign, the 3-inch guns had been removed and replaced with the lighter, but more effective anti-aircraft battery of 10 Type 96 25mm weapons, and 2 triple and 2 twin mounts. This was supplemented by a pair of Type 93 13.2mm machine guns. However, gunpowder was not the Jinsu's main punch. In some respects, Japanese light cruisers were in concept in large destroyers, and were meant to be used to deliver torpedo attacks. For this purpose, she was armed with the excellent 24-inch or 610mm Type 93 Long Lance torpedo. This was an oxygen-fueled weapon, burning a mixture of compressed oxygen and oil to power a 2-cylinder reciprocating engine. This power plant gave the torpedo an outstanding performance, capable of traveling about 40 kilometers at 38 knots or 70 kph, well in advance of the U.S. Navy's standard torpedo at the time, the Mark 15, which could only cover 14 kilometers at 27 knots. The U.S. torpedo also carried a smaller warhead, only 375 kilograms or 827 pounds, compared to the Long Lance's 490 kilogram or 1,080 pound payload. In addition, the Long Lance was very reliable, whereas the American torpedo was notorious for failure to run true or to detonate when a direct hit was scored. This torpedo was probably the best in the world at the time, and was widely employed on Japanese cruisers and smaller warships. Especially early in the war, salvos of Long Lances could surprise American squadrons, who would suddenly find themselves taking hits from these weapons while they considered themselves to be well out of effective torpedo range. The Jinsu carried 8 tubes for launching these powerful weapons, arranged in 4 double mounts. Additional combat capabilities were provided by equipment adequate to carry and lay up to 48 naval mines, and the 1929 addition of a catapult system enabling her to operate a float plane. Her first kill at sea was inauspicious, to say the least. During night maneuvers off the coast of Shimane Prefecture on the 24th of August 1927, she rammed and sank the destroyer Warabi. Sadly, her captain, Keiji Mizushiro, committed suicide over this accident. The Jinsu herself required major repairs, and the opportunity was taken here to give her a flared bow in place of her previous raked one. After her repairs, she was assigned to patrol the China coast, a task which she would perform until the end of the 30s. After the resumption of the Sino-Japanese conflict in 1937, she would frequently operate in support of Japanese landings on the mainland. Her career after the Japanese move against the colonial territories of the Americans and their Western allies was busy. At the outbreak of war, she was stationed at Palau and assigned to the forces taking part in the attack on the Philippines. Specifically, she escorted the invasion convoy that landed Japanese Marines and Army units on Mindanao and supported the troops ashore with gunfire thereafter. By the end of December, as the Philippines were secured, she was assigned to the forces assembled under the command of Admiral Kyuji Kubo, who were given the task of taking the Dutch East Indies. As part of her service here, she took part in the Battle of the Java Sea against Dutch Admiral Karel Doorman's strike force, which was drawn from the extemporized ABDA command, a mixed lot of American, Dutch, Australian, and British ships. Her catapult float plane assisted in the direction of Japanese gunfire, and she took part in the large torpedo strike against the Allied squadron. Her part in the battle was relatively minor, but she was credited afterwards with assisting in the destruction of the HMS Electra. Afterwards, she was sent home to the yards at Kure for repair. While she was there, the Doolittle raid on Tokyo was launched, and the Jinsu was sent, along with many other Japanese Navy vessels, on a fruitless search for the American carrier squadron. A month later, she was assigned to the operation against Midway Island, part of the escort of the invasion convoy following the advance of the carrier fleet. As such, she missed the major action in that critical battle, though her convoy was attacked by the air, once by a formation of B-17 heavy bombers, and later by PBY Catalina patrol bombers armed with torpedoes. Afterwards, she was returned to Japan, where she was assigned to the newly organized 8th Fleet under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, and sent a truck, from where she would begin to proceed towards the Solomons area on the 16th of August. At this time, she was the flagship of Rear Admiral Tanaka, participating in the reinforcement mission previously mentioned, in which she was bombed by Marine SBDs on the 24th. The most common and tenacious opponents the Americans faced at sea were the numerous Japanese destroyers operating there. As a representative type, we'll take a brief look at the Kagero class, 19 of which were built in the last 3 years of the 1930s. These were 2,000-ton vessels powered by 2 steam turbines developing a total of 52,000 shaft horsepower. This gave them a top speed of 36 knots in good condition, matching the performance of light cruisers like the Jinsu. In general, the Kageros were very similar to the Asashios, the class which had preceded them, though they were built with a slightly different hull shape in an effort to improve stability as compared to the older design. Their main batteries consisted of 6 127mm or 5-inch 50 caliber Type 3 guns and 3 2-gun turrets, 1 forward and 2 aft of the main superstructure. Original anti-aircraft armament was 4 Type 96 25mm automatic cannon, mounted in 2 twin mounts placed just ahead of the forward stack. As was the case with virtually all of the naval vessels that participated in the Second World War, this was increased as time went on, until by 1945 the surviving Kageros were carrying as many as 27 of these weapons, as well as supplementary heavy machine guns. The ships also carried depth charges for anti-submarine attacks and paravanes for sweeping moored mines. Their main punch, like that of the Sendai cruisers, were the Type 93 long-lance torpedoes. Each Kagero carried 8 torpedo tubes, mounted in 2 trainable quadruple mounts. 2 torpedoes were carried for each tube, meaning that a single destroyer could unleash 16 of these deadly weapons in a single engagement. Torpedo salvos from Japanese destroyer divisions would prove devastating to Allied warships in the early years of the war, with launches of 70 or more, often fired at very long range, not being uncommon. In late 1942, the Kageros would be equipped with radar, first Japanese destroyer type to receive this vital advantage. First so equipped would be the Hamikaze, a veteran of the Solomons convoys. The other surviving members of the class would receive this upgrade as they were rotated back for repair and refit. The Kageros were extensively used in the Solomons campaign, and suffered a high loss rate. They would be in constant action until the end of the war, or rather one of them would, as only a single member of the class survived. This was the fortunate Yukikaze. Her name, like that of most Japanese light craft, was a poetic one, translating to snowy wind. After the war, This veteran ship was ceded to the navy of Chiang Kai-shek's fugitive nationalist Chinese government, now in exile in Taiwan, who renamed her the Tan Yin. Here, she would serve alongside other captured Japanese and decommissioned American vessels given to Taiwan until she was taken out of service and scrapped in 1970. By the time of the strikes on the destroyer group just mentioned, the Marine SBD presence on Guadalcanal consisted of 19 aircraft, 9 remaining planes from VMSV Su-32 and 10 remaining from Enterprise's Flight 300. These aircraft were in constant action, and maintenance was often neglected both due to the inadequacy of the Henderson field facilities and the difficulties imposed by the high sortie rate and the frequent Japanese night bombardments. Support from the Navy squadrons was greatly depleted by both the consequences of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, which resulted in the withdrawal of the Enterprise for repairs, and the subsequent activities of the Japanese submarine fleet. These had dealt the American carrier force 2 telling blows as the battle raged into the late summer. The Saratoga was torpedoed by the I-26 on the 31st of August and forced to withdraw for repairs. On the afternoon of the next day, the subs had an even greater success, when the I-19 put 3 fish into the starboard side of the Wasp, which went to the bottom shortly before midnight, taking many of her planes with her. This left the Hornet to stand alone as the only large American carrier in the area, to carry on the attempt of providing air support, as well as flying reinforcements onto the field. The frequent night landings by destroyers and other small craft led to the dive bomber pilots attempting night attacks to catch the enemy vessels. The lack of training and equipment for these night sorties led to a predictable lack of success. Contact with enemy ships was rarely made, although on one mission a scouting pair of Dauntlesses did manage to find enemy destroyers off the coast. They were unable to hit the Japanese, but flak from the ships managed to hit a Navy SBD flown by Ensign E.A. Conzet, badly wounding him. His backseater, Aviation Radioman First Class James H. Cales, managed the extremely difficult feat of piloting the stricken bomber back to the field from the rear seat position. Other night pilots were much less fortunate. On the night of September 1st, a 3-plane section of Navy SBDs was scrambled from Henderson as the field again came under bombardment from Japanese destroyers offshore. A salvo from these ships bracketed the aircraft as they began their takeoff runs and sent 2 of them out of control, one to collide with a steamroller parked near the field and another into the trees at the end of the field, totally destroying both aircraft and injuring their crews. In addition to the destroyers and the small craft, the Japanese used convoys of barges to move troops between the islands. On the 4th of September, a group of 15 of these craft was found off of San Jorge Island and attacked by a group of 16 SBDs, 9 from the Navy and 7 from the Marines. Americans sent several of them to the bottom with repeated bombing and strafing attacks throughout the morning. Another similar group of barges was hit by the same force of SBDs the next day, with similar results. The Japanese recorded no fewer than 700 casualties as a result of these 2 attacks. Attacks against destroyer and cruiser targets continued as the struggle for the islands continued. The night of 12 September was a bad one for the Marine aviators at Henderson Field. A bombardment force consisting of the light cruiser Tenru, 3 destroyers, blasted the field that night in conjunction with an attack by Japanese infantry on the American lines, which at this time were only about 2,000 yards or 1,800 meters from the airstrip's perimeter. A naval shell made a direct hit on a Marine aircrew shelter, killing 2 pilots and badly wounding 2 others. Another SBD and its crew were lost that night when they were ambushed while landing by a Japanese float plane fighter that had been loitering near the field. The next day, another Marine SBD was shot down during a strike mission and crashed into the sea with the loss of its crew, while the other plane of its scouting pair was damaged and its pilot wounded. These painful losses were compensated somewhat by the arrival of 12 Dauntlesses of the Saratoga's now homeless Squadron VS-3. Nevertheless, losses continued. One of the Saratoga's planes was shot down during an unsuccessful late afternoon attack on a Japanese convoy on the 16th. 2 days later, the aircraft of Lieutenant L.E. Thornton was shot down by American anti-aircraft fire. A new commander arrived at Henderson during this time, the 57-year-old Marine Brigadier General Roy S. Geiger. This man was no desk warrior, and on the 22nd he led an attack against Japanese positions at Kamimbo Bay on the northwest end of the island's coast. Reinforcements began to arrive to bolster the depleted Marines. A total of 26 SBDs from VMSV 141 arrived from New Caledonia by the 5th of October, as well as 6 more Navy planes from Espiritu Santo, which replaced the survivors of Flight 300, which had been withdrawn to New Caledonia. Casualties among the American flyers were severe. 1 Marine squadron, VMSV 141, suffered 66% casualties during its deployment here. The hazards of enemy action and combat flying were not the only ones faced by the men there. No less than 3/4 of the men on the field contracted malaria. Despite this, the reinforced Cactus Air Force was not granted any rest, and the new arrivals were soon in action against the Japanese fleet. On the 2nd, a pair of Japanese seaplane tenders were spotted heading down the slot towards Tassafaronga. These were laden with 728 officers and men of the 2nd Japanese Infantry Division, along with their tanks, artillery, and other heavy gear. These were escorted by a force of 6 destroyers. An 8-plane strike was flown against them, led by Lieutenant Junior Grade A.S. Frank from Squadron VS-3, but heavy and accurate flak spoiled the dive bomber's aim, and the convoy remained unharmed, continued on to Cape Esperance, and commenced landing its cargo. A night strike of 4 planes was sent against the landing beach, but this was no more successful than the night attacks usually were. Only 2 of the planes found the target, and no damage was done by their attacks. The SBDs continued to have poor luck throughout the first part of October. In a large strike mounted on the 5th, 9 planes from Henderson Field, along with the Hornets SBDs, attacked Japanese shipping to the south of the Shortlands roadstead. These included a force of 6 destroyer transports full of troops headed for Lunga Point. 2 of these, the Minagumo and the Murasame, were damaged by near misses and forced to withdraw, but this was the only damage done in the combined strike. The remaining ships continued on and landed their troops despite the dive bombers' efforts. A night strike was launched against the unloading operation, which was no more successful than any of the others, though the dive bombers illuminated their targets with flares on this occasion, first time they were recorded to have done so in the Solomons area. Another of the principal uses of the Guadalcanal-based dive bombers was to dispatch Japanese warships that had taken damage or had otherwise been delayed in making their getaway after one of the night actions between the rival squadrons in the area. Between the 9th and 13th of October, a series of actions known collectively as the Battle of Cape Esperance took place between cruiser and destroyer forces of the 2 fleets. In the course of this, the Japanese lost the heavy cruiser Furitaka. 2 destroyers stayed behind to rescue the cruiser's survivors, eventually plucking about 400 men from the water. Unfortunately for them, their rescue did not mean the end of their ordeal. The rescue operations had delayed the ships long enough that the daylight caught them still in range of the dive bombers, who found them a short distance north of Russell Island. No fewer than 70 aircraft would be sent after these 2 destroyers in a series of heavy attacks. The first of these, with 16 SBDs, scored only a near miss, but the second wave put 3 bombs close aboard the Murakumo, putting her engines out of commission. This left her a sitting duck for the Avenger torpedo planes accompanying the dive bombers, one of which put a torpedo into her side. This damaged her beyond hope of repair, and she was scuttled not long after. This left only the Natsugumo, which tried to escape further north, but was caught by a third strike of 10 planes from the Navy and the Marines, which dealt her 2 near misses and a direct hit, causing her boilers to explode. The ship sank at sunset. The fate of these 2 destroyers was shared by other Japanese stragglers from the hit-and-run night battle squadrons, and is another illustration of the risks imposed on enemy operations by the American control of the air, exercised in the daytime skies above the Solomons. Had the Japanese retained the airfield, American ships would have faced similar risks in the area. The strength of the Cactus Air Force continued to grow as more reinforcements arrived, until by the 13th of October more than 90 aircraft, half of which were dive bombers, were stationed there. In the late hours of that night, however, these numbers were drastically reduced by a devastating bombardment from the Japanese surface units, including the battleships Kongo and Haruna. These 2 ships rained more than 900 14-inch shells onto the field, destroying more than half of the planes there as well as most of the fuel, leaving only 7 SBDs in flying condition. 9 SBD aircrew, both Marines and Navy men, were also killed in this attack. Surviving dive bombers were given little time to recover from these losses, and were in action later that day. 4 of them attacked a convoy of troop transports in the late afternoon and then again just after dark, but without success. A group of 8 Dauntlesses and their crews from VB-6 Espiritu Santo, left there by the Enterprise after she had departed for repairs to Pearl Harbor, were immediately ordered to Henderson. 9 more Dauntlesses were in reserve at Espiritu Santo as well, though without trained pilots. So great was the need that fighter pilots were ordered to man these bombers and join the rest on the island. However, the next night the Japanese struck again with another nocturnal bombardment. This time the heavy cruisers Chokai and Kinugasa, along with a pair of destroyers, landed hundreds of shells on the airfield. Though these ships had much smaller caliber weapons than the battleships, the intensive pounding left only 4 Dauntlesses flyable. Worse still, 2 of these were wrecked while trying to take off during the attack to strike the bombardment force. In all, only 1 dive bomber was able to get airborne that night to oppose the Japanese fleet, and a large contingent of reinforcement troops were landed under the cover of these 2 nights of heavy bombardment. By means of a tremendous effort of salvage and improvisation, 10 aircraft were patched up and fueled for a strike at 1000 hours the next morning. These found the Japanese transports unloading at Tassafaranga and dove into the attack from 9,000 feet, or 2,700 meters, and blasted the unloading operations, claiming damage to several Japanese vessels. 2 more attacks were launched on the heels of this one, with another wave coming in at 1140 hours. More aircraft were put into flyable shape, and a stronger attack by 20 planes went in at 1315 hours. The results of these assaults were that 3 transports and the destroyer Samudare were hit and damaged. The transports that were hit included the Kyushu Maru, carrying a load of ammunition. She was forced to beach herself after an explosion of her cargo gutted her. This success was balanced by another setback that night, when yet another bombardment force, this time consisting of the heavy cruisers Maya and Yoko and 3 destroyers, plastered the field again, reducing the remaining air strength there to only 10 planes. 7 Marine dive bombers waiting at Efate were hastily flown in to reinforce the base. These arrived in the middle of a Japanese dive bombing attack by Aichi D-3A Vals. The SBDs were unharmed in this attack, but the Japanese scored a direct hit on the American destroyer McFarland, which was being used as a fast transport in the Japanese fashion, and killed 27 of her passengers and crew. Later that day, a Marine dive bomber was shot down by anti-aircraft fire while on a mission to hit Japanese troops ashore, and the next day another SBD, a Navy plane this time, was shot into the sea by a pair of Japanese float plane fighters near Santa Isabel Island, though in this case the crew was rescued from the water. Reinforcements were sent from Pearl Harbor to make up these losses. These included the battleship Indiana and the repaired Enterprise, allowing the battered Saratoga in North Carolina to be rotated home. The Japanese were also increasing the tempo of their reinforcements into the area, preparing for their final big offensive by means of which they meant to drive the Americans off Guadalcanal altogether. The reduced dive bomber presence on the island was unable to make more than a minor impact on this effort, though the destroyer Ayanami was damaged by a Dauntless on the 19th. The next 10 days saw a sharp intensification of the fighting both on land and at sea. Between the 25th and the 27th, a major carrier battle, the Battle of Santa Cruz, was fought, resulting in damage to the Enterprise and the loss of the Hornet. On land, a massive assault on the American positions on the island on the 24th and 25th came very close to overrunning the airfield, compromising the entire American position on the island. This attack was typical of the extremely desperate fighting in the islands. The Japanese fought with tremendous determination and pressed their attacks at all costs, and as a result the attacking troops were almost totally wiped out in the fighting along the airfield perimeter. Despite the repulse of the attack on the 25th, the Japanese believed that they had in fact taken the airfield during the night. As a result, they took less care about getting their ships out of the area by daylight. 6 Marine SBDs were nonetheless airborne that day, and they found 2 groups of Japanese ships coming down the slot. A force of 4 destroyers was headed for Tulagi, and another group of 4, accompanied by the light cruiser Ura, were also spotted heading for the islands. This latter group was attacked at 1300 hours by a force of 5 Dauntlesses. The leader, Lieutenant Commander Eldridge, made a steep dive on the cruiser, releasing his 1,000-pound bomb from the unusually high altitude of 3,000 feet or 900 meters. Nevertheless, he scored a direct hit. This was followed by 2 near misses which left the Ura dead in the water. A second attack by 3 planes from VB-6 resulted in another near miss on the stricken cruiser and one on the destroyer Akazuki, which retreated to the Shortlands for repairs. The Ura, however, was too far gone. Her crew were taken aboard the remaining destroyers, which then sent the crippled vessel to the bottom with torpedoes. Shortly afterwards, 2 Navy SBD squadrons flying from the island, VS-7 and VB-6, were withdrawn, leaving the Marines flying the only Dauntlesses in the Cactus Air Force for the time being. There were 2 Marine squadrons on Guadalcanal, VMSB-141, who had been there for some time, and VMSB-132, who were new arrivals. These operated against continuing Japanese reinforcement convoys in support of the ongoing fighting on the island. On the 7th, a convoy of 11 destroyers carrying 1,300 men, covered by a force of seaplane fighters, was attacked by a mixed force of Dauntlesses and Avenger torpedo planes, damaging the destroyers Takanami and Naganami, which were nonetheless able to continue their reinforcement mission. A 3rd squadron, VMSB-142, led by Major R.H. Richards, arrived on the 12th, bringing the total dive bomber strength to 30 planes. The day the new squadron arrived was eventful. That night, yet another reinforcement operation was run down the slot from Rabaul, this time covered by a heavy bombardment force including the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, which subjected the airfield to a vicious bombardment. The airmen would get their revenge, however, as the bombardment force was intercepted by a force of American cruisers and destroyers, which engaged them at short range in the so-called first phase of the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Both Japanese battleships survived this encounter, but the Hiei had been heavily damaged by close-range American gunfire in the surface action, and Dawn found her still within easy reach of the dive bombers. Attacks were made all through the day, beginning with a single aircraft at first light. The newly arrived squadron mounted the first real strike with 5 planes at 0600 hours. The huge ship was a mere quarter-hour flight away. 3 attacks by units of 5 or 6 planes went in before dusk, pilots claiming 4 or 5 direct hits and several near misses. In addition, attacks by single aircraft in pairs went on throughout the day, as well as numerous attacks by Avenger torpedo bombers. The thick hull armor of the old battleship proved highly resistant to torpedo hits, but one such hit in the afternoon damaged her steering gear, locking her into a slow turn. Thus, unable to evade, the ship was repeatedly blasted by bombs and torpedoes. Eventually, a torpedo hit opened her side and flooded her engine compartments. She began to founder, sinking off of Savo Island that evening, taking about 450 of her crew with her. Loss of the battleship hardly slowed down the Japanese effort. Mere efforts after the Hiei went down, the heavy cruisers Chokai, Maya, and Suzuya, with another pair of destroyers, shelled the field again. The cruisers alone recorded an expenditure of more than 1,000 8-inch or 20-centimeter shells in this night's attack. These later bombardments were not as devastating as those the field had early experienced, though 17 of the Wildcat fighters there were destroyed along with a single SBD. The bombardment force then withdrew, forming up with another unit consisting of the 10,500-ton heavy cruiser Kinugasa, the light cruiser Isuzu, and another pair of destroyers. At 08:06 hours, 5 Marine SBDs found the squadron and attacked, hitting the Maya but causing no serious damage. At 08:50, a scouting pair of SBDs from the Enterprise Squadron VB-10 found the Japanese, and after sending sighting reports and amplification to the fleet, made attack dives with their 500-pound bombs. One of the planes was hit on the way down by a 5-inch shell from one of the destroyers, which punched straight through the fuselage without exploding. Both planes hit the Kinugasa, one on the forward gun turret and another near miss which punched holes in the side, leaving the ship burning and taking on a list. Another pair of SBDs from the same squadron showed up not long after, and glided down out of the sun onto the ships from cruising altitude, before going into their attack dives at 12,000 feet, at 3,600 meters. The lead plane, piloted by Ensign P.M. Halloran, was hit on the way down by Japanese flak, and crashed into the Maya, wrecking an anti-aircraft position, a torpedo tube, and her searchlight, as well as killing 37 sailors and starting a fire. The other plane claimed a near miss on the Chokai and escaped unharmed. Not long after the attacks of the scouting pairs, the carrier planes came in force. This took the form of 17 SBDs from VB-10 and VS-10, each carrying a 1,000-pound bomb. They encountered the cruiser squadron at 10:30 hours. The Navy pilots split their attacks, with 7 planes of VB-10 going after the damaged Kinugasa, while the planes from Scouting 10 attacked the Isuzu. The Dauntlesses scored no direct hits but managed to land numerous near misses on the Japanese ships, leaving the damaged Kinugasa, the light cruiser Isuzu, and the destroyer Michishio without power. The Kinugasa began to settle, and her crew abandoned her at 11:22 hours, the ship sinking not long after to the west of Rendova Island. The Isuzu was towed to the Shortlands, to which the Michishio also retired, limping along under her own steam. Another bombardment was attempted that very night, this time by a force of cruisers and destroyers led by the battleship Kirishima. This force, however, was engaged on the way by a pair of American battleships with 4 destroyers. This action is often referred to as the second phase of the naval battle of Guadalcanal. In the course of this hard-fought action, the Kirishima was badly mauled and had to be scuttled. The devastation of Henderson Field was now fully avenged, as both of the battleships that had mauled Cactus Air Force now lay on the bottom. This also removed the immediate threat of battleship bombardment from the airfield. The dive bombers from the Enterprise, which had hit the cruiser force the previous day, had landed at Henderson. A scouting pair from one of these squadrons found a big Japanese convoy of 11 transports, escorted by 11 destroyers, in the light aircraft Hio. The scouts found the ships near Santa Isabel, and after sending their reports and shadowing the force, attacked with their 500-pound bombs. One of these was destroyed by the carrier fighters, but the pair claimed 1 hit and 1 near miss on the transports. Successive waves of dive bombers attacked the ships, both Navy and Marine planes, ranging from lone attacks to a 24-plane strike mounted at 14:30 hours. These persistent attacks were met by stiff fighter opposition, but nonetheless, the combined airstrikes sank 6 of the 11 transports and forced 1 to return to base in a heavily damaged condition. Force Commander, Rear Admiral Tanaka, nonetheless pressed forward with his remaining 4 transports and beached them off Tassafaranga. The survivors were all destroyed in repeated attacks the next day. The destruction of this convoy was costly to the Henderson Dauntlesses. In one attack, Squadron VB-10 lost 3 out of 7 planes engaged to enemy fighters, while 2 of the remaining 4 were so badly shot up as to be rendered useless. This operation was the most intensive phase of the dive bombers' activity in the Solomons campaign, with a total of 20 ships attacked by the planes of the Cactus Air Force, who sank no fewer than 7. Up to this point, the airmen flying from Henderson accounted for 20 Japanese ships, including 14 laden transports sunk and another 14 damaged. Not long after this exhausting battle, on the 19th, Marine Squadron VMSP-141 was rotated off the island. Of the 78 aircrew of this unit that had begun the campaign, no fewer than 33 had been killed. The battle against the Japanese on the island, and the convoys and naval actions connected with it, continued throughout the end of the year. Destroyers and small craft engaged in supply missions made up the regular targets of the Marine dive bombers. On the 24th, the SBDs hit and damaged the destroyer Hayashio. A couple weeks later, on the 7th of December, the anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack, the Marines attacked a large force of 11 destroyer transports off the coast of New Georgia with a force of 6 SBDs. They claimed hits on 5 of these, but post-war Japanese records indicate only minor damage to one destroyer, the Nawaki. This disappointing result came at the cost of one of the Marine squadron leaders, 35-year-old Major Joseph Saylor, commanding officer of VMSB 132, who was lost along with his backseater, 20-year-old PFC J.W. Alexander, when their Dauntless was shot into the sea during their escape run after their dive. These brave men were lost after anti-aircraft fire damaged their Dauntless, causing its dive ranks to become jammed in the open position. This made the dive bomber slow and unmaneuverable and hardly able to maintain level flight. In this vulnerable condition, they were caught by Mitsubishi F-1M1 floatplane fighters, which riddled the American plane with machine gun fire, causing it to roll inverted and crash into the water. The score was even somewhat on the 16th, when the Marines put a bomb into the destroyer Kagero. Another destroyer, the Ariake, was damaged by a near miss from a 1,000-pound bomb on the night of the 26th. The ship itself was only slightly damaged, but the deck was sprayed with shrapnel, which killed 28 of her men and wounded another 40. The Japanese began to recognize the writing on the wall in January, and from then on the runs to Guadalcanal were undertaken to evacuate their troops still fighting there. Light forces under Tanaka's command began these operations on the night of the 1st, with a force of 10 destroyer transports sent to the island to take the men off. The Marines attacked this group and landed a 1,000-pound bomb close beside the Suzukaze, the shock of which knocked out one of her engines and reduced her speed to 10 knots. As a result, she was detached to head back to the Shortlands under the escort of one of the other destroyers. The other 8 ships continued, picked up their men, and then left the area unmolested. Another sizable effort to rescue the Japanese still on the island was mounted on the night of the 14th, with 9 destroyers this time. This was called Operation Ke, and the ships carried 600 fresh troops to act as a rear guard while the exhausted, emaciated survivors of the Guadalcanal battles were taken off. The ships slipped in undetected, landed their troops and boarded the evacuees without incident. They were found on their way back up the slot to Rabaul, however, and attacked by a force of 15 SBDs. These dealt minor damage to 4 of the destroyers, the Arashi, the Urikaze, the Hamikaze, and the Tamikaze. None of these vessels were disabled, however, and all were able to make it back to their bases in the Shortlands under their own power. Navy SBDs still made an appearance in Henderson on occasion. On the 23rd, for example, 24 dive bombers of the Saratoga's air group staged through their base on their way to hit a Japanese airfield that was under construction at Vila in the island of Kolombangara. However, the dive bomber presence there was maintained almost exclusively by the Marine Corps by this time. On the first day of February, the Marine airmen were out again after a big convoy of 20 destroyers sighted off the coast of New Georgia. Little damage was done to the enemy in this attack, which proved expensive, with 3 planes being lost. One of these was piloted by Lieutenant Abram H. Moss, who was badly wounded by anti-aircraft fire and unable to fly his aircraft. His backseater, Sergeant Gilbert H. Hentz, displayed exceptional coolness in taking the plane over from the rear seat position and flying it back home, instructed via radio by the formation leader, Major Ray S. Room of VMSB 234, who flew his own aircraft close alongside. Unfortunately, the radio on the stricken aircraft began to fail, and the engine began to cough as the bomber ran out of fuel. The Dauntless went into a dive, and Hentz bailed out, but he was struck by the horizontal stabilizer as he tumbled out of the cockpit, and this cut his leg off below the knee. Hanging in his parachute harness, the sergeant managed to stop the bleeding, but it was so weakened that he passed out before he landed in the sea. Luckily, he was picked up by a native craft and brought to Tulagi in comparatively good shape, but the battering experience was too much even for this brave man to withstand, and he died from its effects 2 months later. On the evening of the same day, another force of Marine bombers was sent after another evacuation convoy. This one also of 20 destroyers, but accompanied by a light cruiser as well. At 18:20 hours, as the sun was setting, 17 Dauntlesses dove in with the advantage of surprise. However, these managed only to score a near miss on the destroyer Makinami. Another of the destroyers, the Makigumo, struck a mine in the early morning darkness. A companion, the Yugumo, attempted to take the crippled vessel in tow, but was prevented from making much progress by persistent harassing attacks by a flight of 6 Dauntlesses, which lingered in the area and dove from out of the darkness without any success. As dawn approached, the likely fate of the immobilized ship became more and more obvious, and her crew were taken off and the Makigumo scuttled. Another evacuation operation took place between the 4th and 6th of February. This was carried out by another big group of destroyers, 22 this time, led by the light cruiser Isuzu. This ship had recently returned from the Shortlands, where she had been repaired of the damage inflicted by the dive bombers in the strike that sank the Kinugasa. The squadron was tasked with taking off a portion of the Japanese 17th Army that remained on the island. These were attacked by a force of aircraft from Henderson that included 33 Dauntlesses. The results of this attack were another example of the difficulty the Marine planes often had with swiftly maneuvering targets like the Japanese destroyers. Only two of these, the Shiranui and the Maikaze, took significant damage in this strike. The Maikaze was disabled and taken in tow back to the Shortlands. Another pair, the Kuroshio and the Hamikaze, took minor damage, but they were, like the rest of the force, able to complete their mission. These results were obtained for the loss of 10 Marine aircraft of all types. A last evacuation convoy of 18 destroyers made the run to the island on the night of the 7th-8th of February. These were attacked by 15 SBDs of the newly arrived Marine Squadron VM-SV-144, led by Captain Roscoe Nelson. These found the ships in bad weather and dove on them through heavy rains, inflicting minor damage on the Isokaze and again on the Hamikaze. The evacuation, masterminded by Admiral Tanaka, whose tireless and ingenious efforts to keep the Japanese position alive in the face of American air superiority earned him the nickname Tenacious Tanaka, was a success. A total of 10,695 men were taken off of Guadalcanal once the effort began, and hardly any of these were lost once they made it aboard one of the destroyers. The withdrawal was executed well enough that the Americans were unaware that the Japanese had indeed departed until the 9th. American air power represented by the planes of the Cactus Air Force was instrumental in the American effort to take and hold the Solomons, the first step forward in their campaign to roll back the tide of Japanese expansion that had swept over the Southwest Pacific. As the major component of the striking power base there, the Marine and Navy Dauntlesses that flew from this hazardous base were a decisive factor in the success of the offensive. Countless attacks on land and sea targets made the waters of the Bismarck Archipelago highly dangerous for the shipping on which the enemy effort to throw back the invasion relied. As a direct result of the threat posed by the dive bombers, the Japanese were forced to abandon conventional resupply efforts and resort to night runs by destroyers, light craft, and submarines to move troops and supplies among the islands. This choice was a wise one for the Japanese, as the contrast between the results of the air attacks on the convoy of 11 transports attacked on November 14th was resulted in their virtual annihilation, with the much less effective attacks on the later runs by the large destroyer group shows. Furthermore, these operations were pressed with vigor and tactical ingenuity which reflected great credit on the leadership and resourcefulness of the Japanese captains and their higher leadership, especially that of Rear Admiral Tanaka. Even so, the SBDs made the effort costly. In terms of warships alone, the SBDs sank a heavy cruiser, a light cruiser, and 4 destroyers, and assisted in the sinking of the battleship Hiei. In addition, heavy damage was inflicted on 4 more cruisers and 11 destroyers, with lesser damage to 7 more. The Big Island and its vital airbase were now secure. The fighting in the Solomons archipelago would continue throughout 1943, as the Americans worked their way up the island chain towards Rabaul. However, the main issue had been decided. The Americans were established in the Southwest Pacific, and the rolling up of the Japanese Empire in that region was underway. The Cactus Air Force, and its squadrons of hard-fighting Marine and Navy airmen, were a decisive factor in this crucial victory. And so that's where I'm going to wrap up this episode. I hope you found some of what I had to say here interesting or useful. I find the story of the Guadalcanal campaigns and the battles in the surrounding seas interesting in that they mark a rare phase in the Pacific War where neither side had a decisive advantage in the theater of operations. Before this time, the Japanese were usually dominant. Afterwards, the mobilized industrial power of the United States provided such an overwhelming material advantage that the issue was virtually decided from the outset. The only question was how costly the Japanese could make the Americans' inevitable victory. Next time, we'll continue with the story of the American dive bomber in the Pacific. I don't say Dauntless or SBD because this time we'll be looking at its counterpart in the U.S. Army Air Corps, the A-24 Banshee. This was the land-based version of the Dauntless, and it was the only specialized dive bomber to be operated by the American Army or Air Force. Depending on the length of the resulting episode, I also intend to cover the 2 carrier battles mentioned in this narrative, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons and the Battle of Santa Cruz, which were an important part of the overall strategic picture of the fighting in the Solomon Sea and the Bismarck Archipelago. These may appear in a separate episode, however, as I try to keep these episodes not much longer than an hour or so. So I hope you can join me for those. Until then, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.